So what we did last time was, after talking a little bit about the signals and how we measure them, we started cataloging a few prominent or famous studied ERP components, and we started with the evoked ones, the ones which are bound by the stimulus, mandatory, and we are slowly moving into the ones which we can consider more cognitive, or the ones that which depend on processing of the stimulus rather than the stimulus properties proper. So the one which really stands in between is the component called the mismatch negativity, which some people call it the first intelligent response, the earliest intelligent response, although many other people would contest this animation of the response. But anyhow, it's really a simple thing. You present a series of tones, and the thing about this series of tones is that there is a common one and there is a rare one. The subjects are expected to not listen to these sounds. They actually perform some other tasks like watching a movie or reading a book or playing a video game or whatever, and this is played in the background. And over literally thousands of studies that have been using this component, repeatedly what you see is that you get one response to the beep, the common sound, and another response to the boop, the odd sound or the deviant sound. Okay, and the difference that you see here between these two lines, both recorded from this electrode over here, FZ, okay, is what we call the mismatch negativity. Okay, so this is the frequent, this is the rare. What usually is done is that we subtract the standard response from the deviant response, or the rare from the frequent, and then we get this negativity. This is why it's called the mismatch negativity. Okay. This is this is the topography of the response, and this short movie, which doesn't work, should have shown you the distribution. Anyhow, it's negative here, and it's positive over here, which is typical of auditory responses. Okay, so the basic paradigm is this. Present a series of sounds, infrequently break the rule, have the subject do something else, compare the electrical potentials between these two stimuli, and get your response. Now, the nice thing about this response is that it gives us an index of how the brain or the specific sources of activity, how they compute a model for the environment of what is regular, okay, and how they determine what is irregular. Okay, so I don't have to say too much to convince you that this is really a rich ground for studying things that have to do with these kinds of regularity and deviation and predictions and prediction errors and so on. So that's one thing, but the other thing is that it allows us to figure out which type of information we process without paying attention to the stimuli. Okay, so on both sides of this equation, there is a lot that can be studied, that can be learned from this mismatch negativity, and in fact, over the years, people have used it to probe numerous features of the sounds, starting from very simple, like the sound frequency and its duration and its intensity and location and timbre and the phonetic content, and more complex information. For example, right now in my lab, Tamar is asking whether we automatically form a model or detect a regularity in the chroma of tones. Chroma is the musical notes. Okay, so she presents to the subject a series of the same notes but in different octaves, so very different frequencies. Think about the piano and the tone C or Do, as we say it in Hebrew or in Latin, but it's presented in different octaves, so it's the sounds are very, very different, but there is one thing that is common to them. They're all the note C, okay, musically. And then occasionally there is another note, say C or La or whatever, one of the other notes is presented among these tones, and it's also very different from the other tones in frequency. So if we only process the basic frequencies of the sound, nothing should be irregular about this odd sound. But if we do detect the fact that all of these sounds were the same note Do, then we would get a mismatch negativity, right? So that's the kind of a question you can ask with this type of analysis. I can tell you that although really numerous features are detected, chroma is probably not detected automatically. You needed to pay attention in order to know which tone it is. But aside from these basic features of the sound, or not so basic features, there is. Oh, sorry, I'll jump ahead here. There are examples of detecting regularity on a much higher level, processing. One nice example is the fact that over development we form categories of phonemes. Okay? So as we learn our language, we learn that some utterances belong together to the same phoneme. So even though I pronounce, my B at a certain way, and you pronounce the B in a slightly different way, we all know that it's the same letter, the same phoneme that we try to express, B or B. Okay. Now, what you see here is an experiment in which they presented different vowels to a group of Finnish and a group of Estonian participants. Now, it turns out that there are some phonemes that exist as entities in Finnish but not in Estonian. So the is a distinct phoneme in Finnish but not in Estonian. Okay. Now, for me, all these vowels sound exactly the same. I happened to be in Finland when they did this experiment, or one of these experiments, and in the background I kept hearing like it all sounded exactly the same. Apparently there was some deviance in these sequence of sounds. But what you see here, this is just the amount of negativity and the mismatch negativity, and what you see is that for the Finns, this is different. It elicits the mismatch negativity, but not for the Estonians. Okay, even though it's the very same sound, acoustically it's the same difference. If you measure it, you can see it. But for the Estonians, they just see it as belonging to the regular category, not as a deviant. The other neat thing that you can show with this is that with babies, initially in infants, as they are born, they show mismatch negativity for whatever difference that you make. Any acoustic difference will create a mismatch negativity, but as they learn the language, some differences disappear. They don't hear them anymore because they group them together into a category. So that just shows you what kind of things you can ask with this kind of a feature. Okay. This is one of our studies where we asked whether we automatically localize sounds even when we don't pay attention. Okay, so I have this phenomena which I'm sure you're all familiar with. That my phone rings and I start going like this, like where is it? Okay, which suggests that maybe I simply don't register the location before I turn my attention and look for the sound. But it turns out that we definitely do localize sounds, and what you see here is the response to changes of 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees of the sound. So a series of sounds comes from one location, and then occasionally it deviates by a certain amount of degrees. And you see that not only do we detect the difference, but it follows the amount of difference between the regular sounds and the other sounds. So these are just a couple of examples I'll just say that you can show that with mismatch negativity that we detect regularities in abstract features. So for instance, if I present pairs of tones, one low and one higher, a low tone and a high tone, but the frequencies of these tones varies from one pair to the other. So they can be both relatively low or both relatively high. The only thing that is regular is the fact that the second is higher than the first. And then occasionally I switch and present first the high and then the low. You would get the mismatch negativity. So that's like an abstract feature that we see. Okay, so this is the mismatch negativity, a very simple paradigm which yields very, very rich data. Now, I'm going now into the more endogenous potentials, the ones which really rely on the task that you're doing, and those are usually later in time. As you'll see, they're usually more prolonged. They're not as sharp as the evoked potentials, and their latency might vary much more than the early potentials, which makes sense, right? Because we need processing. There's a variability between subject and the way we do the task and so on. Okay. So I'll start with this target detection and orientation, and here the most used paradigm in cognitive psychology, the oddball paradigm, which is very similar actually to the one I just presented with the mismatch negativity, because here too there is a regular event like this small blue circle which appears on the screen one after the other, not in a series, not like this, but one after the other. There's this blue circle, and then occasionally there is a larger circle, and the subject is required to detect it, to press the button, or to count the number of big circles, to do something about these big circles. So this one we'll call the target. And occasionally you might also introduce into this sequence another odd stimulus which the subject does not have to do anything with. Okay, so that's not a target, but it's still very different from most of the stimuli. So this one we'll call a distractor. Okay, so both the target and the distractor are rare events, but one requires an action, the other one actually requires to suppress an action or not to do anything about it. And then what we see when we analyze the responses to the standards, the targets and the distractors, is that we get two positive responses, the P3A and the P3B. Okay, the P3B is known to some people as the P300, probably the most famous ERP. Okay, but it's called P300 because the initial description by Sutton and others was in a specific paradigm using auditory stimuli, and in their hands the P3 appeared at 300 milliseconds, so they called it the P300. As I said last time, it's better not to adhere so much to the specific latency, because then if you do it in a visual paradigm, or it's other subject, or the target is more rare and so on, the latency changes. So we'll call it P3A and P3B. Okay. The other things I'll show you in a second is that the P3A is more frontal, and the P3B is more parietal in distribution on the scalp, not in the brain. On the scalp, you see it more frontal or more parietal. There's also indication that the P3A is related more to dopamine release, whereas the P3B is related more to noradrenaline or norepinephrine release. And last is that the P3A is associated with the distractor, and the P3B is elicited by the target. Okay?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I totally understand you, but I mean, if I switch I use the target as the distractor, but use the distractor as the target. Why see the same event?
What you'll see is that now, since this is now the distractor, it will elicit the P3A. And since this is now a target, it will elicit the P3B. Okay. Even though you didn't do anything to the stimuli. That's the nice thing. That exactly expresses the fact that it's an endogenous potential. So although you didn't change anything not in the sequence and didn't change anything in the stimuli, the response changes because the subject treats these stimuli differently. Okay? Yeah.
The P3A is the response both to the distractor and target, or only to the
the P3A will be a response to the distractor. There is a question of whether it is hidden within the P3B as well. So you have both responses. Probably yes. Probably you see the P3A and P3B, but they're hidden. They're kind of one big mess. Yeah.
They're separate in space or in time?
Yeah. So here's what they look like. Okay. So this is a response to forget about the single stimulus. It's something related to this specific study. But these are the oddball. This is an oddball paradigm. And so if we just have standards and targets, this is the response to the standard. This is the response to the target, and you get what they call here a P300, but we should call it a P3B. Okay? So that's a P3B. Now, if you have a three-stimulus paradigm where you have standards and target, but occasionally also a deviant, then you get a P3B for the target and a P3A for the distractor. Okay? And the P3A is earlier, and as I said, it's more frontal than the target response. Okay? So the P3A is considered to be an orienting response. Something happened that I need to take care of. Maybe it requires my attention. Okay, so it's an orienting response, and some people call it the novelty P3A. Okay, or novelty P3. And the target response, the oddball, that's a big question. What exactly are we seeing? Why do we see this big response? And one of the models which people cite frequently is that what happens, the reason that we see this big response is that since we detected a target, which we were waiting for, we were holding in working memory the target and waiting for it to appear, and now it appeared, then there is this kind of a updating of working memory. I'm updating my working memory, and that's what I see as the P3B. But I don't want to commit too much to the cognitive explanations. It's definitely a simplistic explanation, especially that there are a lot of sources. I'll say in a second. This is actually the study which collected different sources of information regarding the neural sources of the P3A and the P3B. And since it's such a popular component to use, there have been many studies trying to figure out what is happening in the brain when you see the P3B and the P3A. And what they collected here is bold responses, fMRI, which cannot say that they studied the P3A or the P3B because they're using bold responses, right? But the paradigm is such that allows you to associate it with either a distractor or a target. Okay, so these are the white and the black dots. Okay, then the contours, the white and black contours, show you results from lesion studies, patients who had brain lesions and showed reduction or enhancement of the P3A or P3B. So these are the white and the black contours, and then the shadings. You see sometimes you see like a white shading over here or a black shading over here. These are data from intracranial recordings from ECOG, okay, where patients had actually electrodes over their brains before epileptic surgery. And by and large, what you can see is that there is quite a big overlap between the P3A and the P3B response. Okay, but it's not a complete overlap. Okay? So there's some differences between these conditions. For example, with the bold, we see responses in the hippocampus for the P3B, but not from the P3A. Okay, so questions about the P3? Yeah.
What's the probability of a single instance, like the signal? Is it very clear to tell if it's like P3A or P3B, or only like on the traces you got are obviously from
averages, right?
But the brain itself doesn't wait an hour to average the signal.
Right.
So
right.
How much to do there?
So I don't know if you remember that last Were you here last week? So I showed a slide explaining the question of how many trials do you need to average in order to see something, and one of the examples was the P3B. Okay, so with both of these components are pretty large. Okay, they're some of the largest components that we get. They could be tens of microvolts sometimes, as opposed to the mismatch negativity, which is between 1 and 2 microvolts. Okay, so it's relatively big, and sometimes you can see it in single trials. Okay, but usually not. However, you definitely respond on a single trial basis, right? As you said, your brain responds, and using more sophisticated tools like classification, you can get what to me was amazingly good results by trying to classify. So we have a tool that does the classification exactly on this kind of a target detection, and you can get to very, very high classification of single trials using this tool. So definitely the response is single trial. You can't usually many times see it on the waveform, but you can see it if you look more globally. Okay, and another couple of components that I'm going to mention. One has to do with object recognition, and that is a little bit odd because I'm trying to talk about endogenous components, and this is actually an evoked response. Okay, but I put it in this context because we see here a response which depends on more elaborate processing, on categorization. Specifically, this is the response called the N170, which is actually a variation of the N1, of the visual N1. So I told you last week that when you show a visual stimulus, you get a P1 response and then an N1 response. And it turns out that when you show a face rather than many other objects, you get a response, an N1 response, which is bigger and also has a little bit of a different topography. Okay, so it is more lateral on the scalp than all these other responses. Its maximum is more lateral. So this is a face-sensitive N170, and it's probably the most studied and one of the very few components which you can say that are very selected for a specific category of stimuli. We don't have so many responses like this which are very sensitive to a specific category. That doesn't mean that our brain doesn't respond differently to other categories as well. I mean, there might be clusters of neurons which respond specifically to butterflies or to flowers or to cars or to words. There probably are, okay, these clusters. But for some reason, it's very hard to see them when we record on the scalp. One possible reason might be that faces are more preserved over subjects. So subjects have a very similar response to faces, but may have a more variable response to the other categories. So when I try to find these specific responses, it always requires averaging over subject, and then if there's more variability, it will look like there is no specific component for the other categories, but there is one for the faces. Yeah.
Does it appear in the same electrodes as the N1?
So this you can see this here. So the negativity is red here in this drawing, and you're looking at the head from above. You see the nose over here. Okay. So this is the typical topography of the N170, with negativity here on the two sides and more positivity over here. The responses to the regular N1, if I just show a checkerboard like I showed last week, or if I show other categories, then the N1 will be smaller, and this negativity will be much more central. So it will move from here to here. It will be over here. It's hard to see in this one, but it's usually like over here and over here.
Does it sort of co-localize with places where it's in fMRI?
So this has, of course, been case for many studies trying to merge what we know from, for instance, the fusible face area and N170. Currently, it looks like the N170 is not a manifestation of the FFA. It doesn't come from the FFA. It's probably for more lateral sites that are sensitive to faces, maybe the occipital face area, okay, which is another of these blobs that you see in fMRI. But it's not straightforward to make the comparison. Okay. What did I say about this? I'm going to skip some. The other component I'm going to talk about is the N400, okay, which is a component which was first described regarding linguistic information. So any of you who are interested in language, and especially in the lexical and semantic part of language, this is a dissection tool for you. The intriguing phenomena that was described by Martha Kutas and then her students was the following. So you have a sentence like, it was his first day at work, okay? And you have sentences like, he spread the warm bread with socks, okay? The difference between them is obviously the fact that this last word was expected here, is unexpected over here, okay? And imagine I had another sentence which also ended with socks, but it was expected, okay? So I put on my shoes and socks, okay? Or I would have something that where work would be unexpected. So every word could be expected or unexpected. And then I look at the ERPs, and in this particular drawing they showed, it's usually not done, but they show here the responses to the whole sentence. So you can see the response to each word. These are auditory, they're presented orally in this case, but they could just as well be presented visually, it doesn't matter. And what I want to point out is the difference between the purple line, which is the response to the expected word, to the sentence with the expected word, and the the broken line, the blue broken line, which is the response to the unexpected word. And here negativity goes up. Okay? So when the word is unexpected, you get a bigger response. Over here, this is about 300 to 500 milliseconds after the stimulus was heard. And therefore it was called the N400 because it peaks around 400 milliseconds. And the interesting thing is that over the years, people have tried many manipulations in trying to see what actually makes the N400 smaller or bigger. And look at this, for example. Okay, so what I showed you before was the sentence final. Okay, this is the last word in the last word in the sentence. Bigger more negative N400 for the incongruent or unexpected word. Okay, that's what we just saw. If the word unexpected word is within the sentence, expected or unexpected, you get the same thing. Okay, a bigger N400 for the unexpected. If, for instance, you just use a repetition of words, so either you present the same word twice or two different words, and you look at the response to the second word. So one is repeated and one is unrepeated. You would get a bigger N400 for the unrepeated word. Okay? Even more interesting maybe is if I just take words, single words, and I choose words which are frequent in the language, that you can kind of hear them every day, or words which are rare. You maybe have read them 3 times in your life, or okay, you may hear them at some arcane radio shows. And I compare the responses to these two words. You get a bigger response to the rare word. Okay. So altogether, what would you say the N400 what might it represent? What? Prediction error. That would pardon? Okay, so that would explain very well, I think, where it's when it's within sentences or in the sentence final. I'm not sure exactly about the repetition. If you have like half of the words are repeated and half of the words are unrepeated, Or if it's a word frequency, it's not exactly that I expect specific words.
Frequency can
Hmm?
still, I think,
Frequency
still
might be thought of as expectation. I agree. What else can?
Just coding
Hmm?
how frequent a word is.
But how would that explain? How would that explain the word final, for instance? Where is it? The word here. What? How would
You
it?
just don't expect to have such words in this context, in sentences that are formed in a similar way. So it's uncommon, so you react more. And again, with your
Okay, but
repetition,
uncommon that you react more. You're just describing the phenomenon. But what kind of cognitive process? What kind of computation?
familiarity.
Hmm?
Familiarity.
Familiarity, that is good for the frequency, but it's not, the socks, socks are as familiar if I present them within...
Familiarity within a context.
Oh, familiarity within a context. So, okay, so you're saying that we somehow make a note of how familiar we are with this kind of sentence, the whole context?
Not the exact sentence, but yes, I think that there may be related semantic fields that are more ready when you feel the sentence. And you expect something from a general group.
Okay, so one thing that I think was in both of your explanations is that there's something definitely about the context. Okay, so what we see here is that and this was the first message that Matakutas wanted to convey in her studies, was that when we process a word, we don't process it in isolation. So the way we process it in very early, I mean, this is 300, 400 up to milliseconds after the word has been produced or seen. The way we process it already depends on the context in which we are. Okay, and the sentence, for instance, the word that came before has set a context for the processing of this word. Now you can think of it as a prediction error, as you suggested. You want to say something else?
I'm not clear about repeated and unrepeated.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
The experiment just you can have words which are repeated, so the critical word that you're looking at the M400 for has either been repeated, so it's the second time that you hear the word in a row, okay, or the word before was a different word. Okay. Yeah.
We've seen before that there are similar spikes also for like visual stimuli or sounds, like when sort of prediction error, like in general. So is it obvious that all of these instances are like the same exact spike, or maybe they're also like a bit different, or like?
It's a very good question. I don't have a conclusive answer, but I can say that what seems to be the case is that in many situations, either with words or there's somewhere here like line drawings. Okay, if I do the same, but instead of with the final word, I present a drawing. Okay, or in our experiments when we presented scenes in which there was an odd object, so we replaced it. There's somebody playing a violin, and we worked in Photoshop and replaced the violin with a broom. Okay, so the scene with the incongruent stimulus produced a bigger N400 than the congruent scene, and they all with the same kind of topography and more or less in the same latency range. Okay, so I cannot vouch for the fact that it's all exactly the same response, but it's the same cognitive manipulation seems to be, and it's the same topography and same latency, which the three of those make a component.
And it's unique for semantic tasks.
Okay, so that's an important thing. So continuing our discussion from before, that it seems to be that the N400 has to do something with the meaning, okay, with the semantics of the information, or if it's in language, it might be lexical, okay, and yeah, please.
I want to ask if this may be some kind of integrating of some kind of annotation to an expected word, and then.
So yeah, you can always, the predictions can be implemented by a type of adaptation. So it could be the mechanism, and that would go along with what I was going to say, is that people have thought about this as lexical or semantic search. Okay, so when I'm presented with a word, I need to look for its meaning. So the way I would look for its lexical entry to find it as a word, and then would extract the meaning of the word. Now, if the word is expected, what this shows is that the expectation allows me for like a pre-search, and I can get the what people have called the logogen, like the pattern of activity that is typical of this word. I can get it a little bit more activated in advance because I know it's coming. So why should I wait? Okay, so I get it prepared. Whereas when I don't know what's coming, or when I have an unexpected word, I need to start from scratch. I need to start from scratch, looking in my library for the lexical entry and for its meaning. So the bigger N400 in this kind of explanation represents the longer, more intense in lexical or semantic search. And there's been many debates about whether it's lexical or semantic that I'm not even sure I understand all of these nuances of the studies. But people were willing to tear each other's hair for the question of whether it's semantic or lexical or something like that. But this is the kind of question that you can ask with ERPs by clever manipulations. So altogether, I would say that if you want to like a simple description of what elicits the N400, whenever you have something which is semantically unexpected, you would get a bigger N400. Yeah.
The DEF, it seems that related to if it makes sense or not, right? Or it's also the same representation that so in all the other express, we presented the concept in the concept as incomplete,
Right.
but in the DEF, it seems like it's different. Is that still? Could you explain what?
Yes, that's actually an important point. So in all of these, in the initial experiments that were done with N400, there was always something about expectation. You build an expectation through a sentence or through. What this shows is that it's not a necessary condition for eliciting the N400 to have some kind of a context. Okay, it's enough to present stimuli which are harder to understand. Okay, because they're rare. Okay, or because they weren't primed by a previous word. Okay, and so on. Now, another thing that tells you that this is not specific, not just an audible response. One of you suggested similarity between this and the mismatch negativity, for instance. So, to show that this is not simply an audible response, what they did is to also use differences which are not semantic. For example, it could be a visual difference, like the word would be in bigger font, okay, or it could be a lexical, a syntactically unexpected word. So, in Hebrew, for instance, it could be a sentence starting with a feminine, and then the last word would unexpectedly be masculine. Okay? Or it could start with the plural, and then you present something which is odd because it's in the singular at the end. Okay?
This won't cause.
No, this won't cause an N400. Just the opposite, it would cause this P500 or P600 positivity in this later positivity. Very systematically, there's a very big difference between semantic incongruity and syntactic incongruity. And there are other components which I'm not mentioning today because they're too specific, that if you're interested, that you can look at, that are sensitive to specific syntactic deviations. Okay, so it's what I wanted you to take home from this is that the ERPs are like a crude measure. You remember my analogy of the soccer game, and you're standing outside and you're just listening to the crowds. But if you do the right experiment, you can use the responses to get very interesting conclusions about stages of processing that you're targeting here. Okay. So we already talked about attention, right? So and I want to go on to so one more thing that I want to show. So up until now, we talked about the time domain. We looked at how potentials evolve within, until now, specific electrodes over time, and we looked for differences in the amplitude of the components. But you can also decompose the time series into their spectral parallels. Okay, so you can move from the time domain to the frequency domain, and in some cases this can be pretty useful. I'm sure for most of you I don't need to talk about how you do this, Fourier transform or wavelets. If anyone needs more explanation, then we can go over it later. But the important thing is that over the years, especially in the clinics, this frequency domain was even more used than the time domain. So people divide the EEG into different bands like the delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. The reason for the names is just the order in which they were described. So you will notice that there is no systematic movement here. But these are bands which tend to kind of change together in different situations. I also already showed you the alpha band, which already Berger saw with his initial recordings, and I also showed you the alpha activity in my student in this movie last time. Now, to look at more cognitive components in the temporal domain, we need to do something which is kind of like ERPs, but in the spectral domain. And for that, people have been using something called time frequency decomposition, which means that you have some waveform in time, and you want to look at the spectral content, but not overall, but specifically over time. Okay? So the way to do it is to basically have this kind of frequency by time plot, and then run a window over this waveform. So you take a window and you run it over the waveform, and for each time point that you move, you compute the spectrum. So each column, of this image represents a spectrum at one given point. Okay, so this is one spectrum, another spectrum, and then you put them together, you get this nice, colorful time frequency plot, which has become the target of many studies in recent years. There are several ways of doing it. You can either use this window and running Fourier transform, or you can do it with wavelets. So these are different filters. What's common to them is that they have the same number of cycles, but as you can see, lower frequencies have longer windows, and higher frequencies have narrower windows, and you do the same. You run it over. So this is a hand waving frequency decomposition. And using this kind of time frequency responses, you can start asking whether specific frequencies at specific times vary as a function of the experimental manipulation. And this is a very famous example that I'm going to tell you later, which is that it's a mistake, but it's a famous result which illustrates nicely the way this is done. So you have two different objects that subjects have seen, either Kanitsa triangle, you all see the triangle, right? Or if you just do the same thing and have the same stimuli but rotate these Pac-Mans, so it's visually very, very similar. With the only difference is that in one you see a coherent object and in one you don't. And if you look at this window over here, you see that when you see a triangle, either because it's really there or because there is an illusory contour form, you get a big activation at this gamma band region, okay, from 30 hertz and up around 300 milliseconds. But if you rotate the Pac-Man, this activity is much smaller. Okay, so this is a type of response that you might connect to things like binding. Okay, whenever you have a binding or you create a coherent object, you get an increase in the power of gamma around 300 milliseconds after the time of occurrence of the object, and then you can plot where exactly on the scalp you see this effect, and you see that it's over here, over occipital parietal scalp. Okay? So don't take it as a fact, because as I said, this turned out to be an artifact later, but it still is a good example of how this thing is done and should be done, except for if it's an artifact. So Aviv is saying, I have to take a break. Okay? So this is exactly the right time to take a break. Okay. I forget, in how to film there are no breaks. People just talk.
איך אתה רואה מעבר למה שרואים בניסויים התנהגותיים? כי אתה לא יודע בסוף להגיד מאיפה זה בא או מה הסיגנל. כי קצת קשה לי עם זה, כי אנחנו יודעים שאם בן אדם רואה משהו ולא רואה, זה ברור שיש לזה קשר למה שקורה במוח, אבל איך אתה רואה לי להבין מה קורה?
שאלה מעולה. שאלה מעולה שאני גם חושב עליה הרבה. אז אנשים משתמשים ב-ERPs בכל מיני צורות. צורה אחת, באמת פשוט בתור עוד מדד התנהגותי. זה לא שזה, וזה תורם לנו הרבה מעבר למדדים התנהגותיים רגילים, אבל זה מדד התנהגותי. זאת אומרת, אני במקום להסתכל על זמן תגובה, אני מסתכל על ERP ואיזה קומפוננט, ואני יכול לתת לך המון דוגמאות שבהן לא יכולתי לקבל את המידע הזה רק מלחיצת על הכפתור או מדיווח של המידע. כי זה דרך שלך להסתכל על ההתנהגות של המוח בלי לשאול את הנבדק שום דבר. למשל, בפרדיגמות שבהם את לא רוצה שהנבדק ילחץ על כפתור. לא, אפילו במסנס נגטיביטי. איך אני יכולתי לדעת אם הנבדקים שלי מפענחים את המיקום של הצליל בלי קשב? אם אני אבקש מהם להקשיב, אז...
דברים כאילו, אין נראה שזה לא חופרו או...
אז לפעמים יש ולפעמים אין. אני יכול, אפילו עכשיו גם שתי דוגמאות ממש טובות במעבדה שמראות שבלי לעשות ERPs לא היינו מגיעים למסקנות כאלה. יש למשל המסקנה של מרתה קוטה-סימה, N400, זה שהעובדה כשאנחנו מפתחים מילה, אנחנו כבר עושים את זה בקונטקסט של המשפט. אז יש דרכים.
פריימינג אבל בניסויים עם הבנק שהוא יכול להיות...
לא, אז בפריימינג את לא יודעת, בפריימינג את לא יודעת בסופו של דבר מתי בדיוק קרה האפקט, האם זה קרה שהוא היה רטרואקטיבי או שבזמן הפענוח של המילה. את יכולה לחשוב על זה שאחרי ששמעת את כל המשפט, את אומרת, אוקיי, עכשיו אני אעשה אינטגרציה של כל המשפט, כן? ועכשיו אני אראה אם המילה הזאת הייתה נכונה או לא נכונה, ואז זמן התגובה שלי יושפע מזה. אז אני יכול לתת עוד, באמת, זה לא קשה לי למצוא דוגמאות שמראות ש-ERPs תורמים, אבל כמדד התנהגותי, בלי להגיד לך שום דבר על המוח. זאת אומרת, אם הייתי מודד skin conductance response, לא יכולתי, בחלק מהמקרה, לקבל תשובות. זה לא אומר שזה במוח זה מקרה. זה מקרה, כי שם נעשה עיבוד, אבל זה לא אומר שום דבר על המוח. וזה הכוח העיקרי של ERPs. אבל זה בא מהמוח, כן? אז בכל מיני שיטות של converging evidence יחד, שימוש ב-FMRI, יחד עם זה שעושים בזהירות רבה source localization, יחד עם העובדה שזה כן נותן לך את האפשרות להגיד מתי דברים קרו, יותר מכל שיטה אחרת, כן? כמה מוקדם בתהליך, אני חושב משהו כזה או אחר. זה אני יכול להסיק איפה זה קרה בתהליך העיבוד. אז זה נותן לי גם מידע יותר ספציפי על המוח ואיך שלבים בהיררכיה עובדים. מה? למשל מה?
כי אני... לא בודקת את לקרוא. למשל לגבי הזמן, אני יכול לשאול עם הסצנות האלה שהצגנו שהיו קונגרואנטיות ולא קונגרואנטיות. אז השאלה היא, האם ה-incongruence זה דבר שקורה מאוחר, אחרי שתפסתי כבר את כל הסצנה ואני עושה איזו אינטגרציה של כל האובייקטים ולכן אני מחליט שהסצנה הזאת היא סבירה או לא סבירה, או שאני בונה את הסצנה מלכתחילה כשאני מפענח כל אובייקט, אני כבר מפענח את האובייקט הזה על רקע הסצנה. כאילו יש לי תפיסה ראשונית של הסצנה ואז אני מפענחת אובייקטים ספציפיים ומפענחת אובייקטים ספציפיים ואז מפענחת.
בדיוק. אז על ידי ERPs ב-N400 אפשר היה להגיד, אוקיי, זה קורה בשלב כזה כל כך מוקדם, ב-220 מיליסקנד אנחנו כבר רואים הבדלים, כן? בניתוח באותו זמן שאנחנו יודעים שמפענחים אובייקטים, כן? זאת אומרת, זה לא אחרי שפענחתי את כל האובייקטים. 220 מיליסקנד אחרי שהראיתי את הסצנה, כבר יש לי הבדל בין סצנה שהיא קונגרנט ואינקונגרנט.
זאת אומרת שהאינקונגרנס נכנס האינטגרציה היא כבר חלק מהעיבוד של האובייקטים, היא לא פוסט-פורט, זה לא קודם אני מפנף אובייקטים, אז יש אינטגרציה. למשל, זה דוגמה אחת. עכשיו למשל בעבודה...
זה גם משמעות ההתנהגותי. כאילו...
זה קומפיוטיישנל יותר מאשר להגיד משהו על בדיוק איפה זה קורה במוח או איזה נוירון פועל מתי. כן. אני לגמרי מסכים, זאת אומרת, אני רוצה להגן עליה כי אני מלמד את זה, אני רוצה להגן על זה, אבל אני יותר בצד שלה. אני חושב ש-ERP זה כלי נהדר, אבל התרומה שלו יותר בדיסקציה חישובית מאשר בלהגיד משהו על אזור מסוים במוח שפעיל או לא פועל. אני חושב שזה פחות מעניין, אנחנו רוצים להבין איך הקומפיוטיישנל עובד, כן? הנה, אני אתן לך עוד דוגמה, בערך. עשינו ניסוי שבו, יודעת מה זה LRP? Lateralized Readiness Potential? אם את מסתכלת על הגולגולת מלמעלה, ואת עכשיו הולכת להפעיל את יד שמאל, אז נגיד ב100 מיליסקנד לפני שאת מפעילה את יד שמאל, זה נהיה ממש שלילי מעל המטרופורטקס בצד ימין. אז אם אני, ולהפך אם את מזיזה את יד ימין, אז אם אני מחסיר את האלקטרודה הזאת מהאלקטרודה הזאת, אני מקבל משהו שנקרא Lateralized Readiness Potential. זאת אומרת, זה הזמן שלחצתי על הכפתור, אז אם לחצתי ביד ימין אני מקבל דבר כזה, ואם לחצתי ביד שמאל אני מקבל דבר כזה. ואם אני פשוט הופך את זה לצורך העניין, אז אני מקבל תמיד משהו כזה. זה הקונטרלטרל פחות הפסילטרל. אז עכשיו עשינו ניסוי שבו הראינו למבדקים פריים שהם לא ראו, הוא היה מנוסח, הם לא ראו אותו.
מה אמרו?
הם לא ראו. פריים מנוסח שיכול היה להיות חץ ימינה או חץ שמאלה או ניוטרל. ואז אחר כך, אחרי שהם ראו את הפריים המנוסח, הם ראו חץ ימינה או חץ שמאלה, שאמר להם שחצו ביד ימין וביד שמאל, או שהם ראו סימן של פלוס שאמר להם שחצו ביד יד שבא לך. אז כמו שאת יכולה לצפות, הפריים עשה משהו, כן? זאת אומרת שבמקרים האלה, אם זה היה אותו פריים, אם הפריים היה תואם, אז זה היה יותר מהיר, ובמקרה הזה הם נטו יותר קצת ללחוץ לכיוון של הפריים ולא לכיוון ההפוך. עכשיו השאלה היא, מה את עושה בכלל כשאת רואה פלוס כזה ואומרה לך תחצי מה שאת רוצה? אין לך שום סיבה מיוחדת ללחוץ ביד ימין וביד שמאל, אז את יכולה להיות משותקת, כן? תמימים, לא, בעצם אין לנו ביד שמאל, ככה אנחנו פשוט מוכרת בגוף של קוקה קולה. אז זה יכול להיות, אבל אחרת אין לך שום סיבה, זאת אומרת, אוקיי, אז כנראה שמה שקורה זה שזה random walk, ואם אני במקרה הייתי יותר קרוב, זה שני ספים, כן? והייתי יותר קרוב לכאן, אז כנראה שאני אבחר את זה, כן? אם הייתי יותר קרוב לכאן,
פריים זה לפני התחלה.
נכון, אז הפריים צריך לדחוף אותך לאחד הכיוונים, נכון? אז הצגנו את הפריים. אז בחלק מהמקרים באמת זה דחף את זה. מה קורה באחרים? מה קורה בתועלת האחר? למה לא בכל המקרים שהצגנו את הפריים זה דחף אותם ללחוץ בכיוון הזה? הרי everything else being equal לדבר, פריים זה דבר היחידי שהיה יכול לגרור את חברה. אז השאלה אם זה העניין, או שמה שקרה זה שהפריים השפיע ודחף אותם באמת לכיוון, ובכל זאת הם נבדקים באיזושהי דרך שאולי זה בגלל רעש, דחפו את זה לכיוון השני, איך אני יכול לדעת? אז נסתכל על ה-LRP, ומסתבר שמה שקורה זה שאנחנו מסתכלים על ה-LRP.
אתה אומר, אם יכול להיות שהפריים בכלל לא השפיע במקרה?
נכון, כי יכול להיות שהוא מוסך, את יודעת, לפעמים זה הצליח לעבור את העוד ויז'ואל קורטקס, לפעמים לא, המיסוך היה כל כך טוב שלא ראה שם דבר. האפקטים של הפריים תמיד חלשים, כן? אז מה שהסתכלנו, מה קורה במקרים שהנבדקים לוחצים הלכו עם הפריים או הלכו נגד הפריים. זה רק במקרים של free choice. אז מה שאנחנו רואים זה שאם הם הלכו, אם זה היה ניטרלי בכלל, אז את רואה את במקרה הזה, כאן הופיע הפריים, אוקיי? אז את רואה ממש כזה, אוקיי? זה lateral readiness potential. אם לעומת זאת היה פריים, אני נבדק לך בכיוון הנכון, אז זה מתחיל לרדת יותר מוקדם. לא מפתיע אולי, הפריים גרם לו להתחיל להתכונן כבר כאן, כן? אבל כשנבדק לך בכיוון כנגד הפריים, אז אנחנו רואים דבר כזה. זאת אומרת שהפריים נכנס, הוא בד, הגיע עד המוטור קורטקס, כן? גרם לו כזה. מפני שהפריים היה בכיוון ההפוך.
אוקיי, סבבה.
זה כאילו אינקונגרואנטי. זה המצב הנוטרלי, זה המצב הקונגרואנטי וזה המצב האינקונגרואנטי. אז מזה אנחנו יכולים להסיק שהפריים היה אפקטיבי, הפעיל את המוטור קורטקס, ואף על פי כן הנבדק שזה עשה overruling לפריים הזה, ואז אפשר להתחיל לבנות מודל של איך זה קורה, רעש, לא רעש, כל מיני דברים כאלה, אבל את זה לא יכולנו לקבל, את המידע הזה לא יכולנו לקבל אלא על ידי הסתכלות על ERP.
כן, אבל שוב זה התנהגותי. כאילו,
הסתכלתי על הפעילות המוחית, מה זה התנהגותי? לא למדתי שום דבר חדש על פעילות, לא למדתי שום דבר חדש על המוח. אני השתמשתי במוח.
לא, סבבה.
כן, זה מה שאתה רוצה להגיד? אז אני מסכים איתך לגמרי. אני חושב שב-ERP בדרך כלל מה שאנחנו עושים זה שאנחנו משתמשים במוח כדי לעשות דברים כאלה. יש פה ושם ניסיונות שתוכל להתווכח איתם, אני הרבה פעמים מתווכח איתם, כן? שמנסים להגיד יותר מזה, כן? למשל, להראות שבמצבים של קונפליקט אנחנו מפעילים את הסינגולט קורטקס. רוב המידע על זה בא מ-ERP, מניסיונות למקם פעילות ב-ERP. אפשר להתווכח אם את מאמינה לזה, לא מאמינה לזה, אם יש converging evidence שתומכים בזה או לא, אבל אפשר לנסות לעשות את זה, אבל זה החלקים החזקים יותר.
כן, זה לא עניין, כאילו זה.
אני מסכים איתך. אני מסכים.
בינה, מה סתם מעניין אותי אם אתה נותן את ה... כי זה לא נותן פריים שהוא חץ, אלא משהו. כאילו, זה נותן אור בצד.
אקזוג'נס, גם את האנדוג'נס קיו, אבל את האקזוג'נס קיו. לא עשינו את זה, ומעניין לבדוק. אפשר להתחיל כבר, נכון? רוצים להתחיל? עם יונתן? כן, נקווה שנה הבאה. מה נשמע? הכל בסדר? מתששים?
היא עדיין בחוק הבא.
טוב, דברים פתאום קורים, מה?
זה קשה גם שזה פוזיטיבי, כן.
בשבוע הבא ביקשנו מגבי להרצות, אבל אתה פטור
לא יודע.
כן, כי לא חזרת אליי, אמרנו שתחזור אליי ותגיד את זה יותר חסוק, אז לא רציתי... זהו, אז לא רציתי להעיק עליך וכל הדברים האלה, אז ביקשנו מגבי על זה גם. על סימוליישן. מה שהיה צריך להיות, מה שאמור היה להיות.
אני חוזר, כאילו, יש לנו את השבוע עכשיו, עד 50.
Okay, so the next part of the talk will be an attempt to show you a little bit how we quantify ERPs and to show you especially what are the things that we have to think about when we quantify ERPs, because there are many points which are subtle that we may need to make decisions about. Okay, so I'm going to talk about several things, about averaging, about artifacts, about what is the functional unit that we want to actually measure, how we determine the baseline, the reference, and a little bit about statistical inference. So I'm going to talk more about some of these and less about the others, simply because of time constraints. And let's start with artifacts. Okay, so we put electrodes on the skull. Okay, we try to measure neural activity in the brain. Unfortunately, together with the neural activity, our electrodes pick up any other electrical activity which is happens to be in the neighborhood. Okay? And these interfere with our ability to measure what is really our focus of interest, which is brain activity. I want to make one point very clear, and it's not necessarily about ERPs, but it's a general comment about artifacts that you need to know when you do anything that has to do with the measurements. There are two types of artifacts. One is problematic, and the other is horrific. Okay, so and the one that is really a problem and frightens us, worries us when we do research is if we have an artifact which is a systematic one, an artifact which is in some way locked to the same manipulation or the same events that we try to measure. Okay, because those will mimic as if they are real things that we might actually write a paper to Nature and describe them. Okay, and the other artifacts, which are kind of random and happen here and there, they will interfere with our ability to reach conclusions. And they also might lead us to the wrong conclusion, but they're not as problematic or as risky as the locked artifact. So the one important thing that you want to do in any experiment is to make sure that you're not measuring an artifact in the sense that you don't have something which is evoked by your stimuli or by your events. And I'm going to give you an example later of this kind of a systematic artifact. So, but let's start with a general question of what causes the artifacts. And these are the main sources of electrical artifacts. The muscles that we have on the head and the neck are big sources of electrical activity. The eyes are a big source of electrical activity for three reasons. One is the corneoretinal dipole. It's an electrical dipole, potential difference between the cornea and the retina. This dipole points forward usually, and as you move your eyes, it moves with your eyes, okay, right and left. And therefore it will affect the electrodes differently as you move your eyes left and right, and it's close to the electrodes and it's big, and so it makes a big artifact. So that's one of the sources. The other thing is that the eyes have muscles that move them. So again, we have muscle artifacts that we record when the eyes move. And the third one is when we blink. What happens when we blink is that the eyelid goes down over the eye. It touches the cornea. And since the cornea is charged, as I just said, it actually shortcuts this potential to the electrodes. So we get a big change in the electrodes close to the eyes when we blink, and it actually affects most of the electrodes that are on the skull. Okay, so blinks and this dipole and the muscles create artifacts when the eyes move, and this is one of the reasons that I told you that we actually have electrodes around the eyes so that we can measure when the eyes move. And even better, if we can have an eye tracker concomitantly with the EEG, we can control for eye movements even better. The third one here is the line noise, which is obvious. Electrical devices like the computer screen or the computer itself or fans elicit electrical fields, and those can be picked up, especially if there's a high resistance, high impedance between the electrodes and the skull. Then this noise will be picked up heavily. Other sources of artifacts have to do with failures of sorts. So the amplifier may get saturated, so you can't get higher than some level, and then if you get higher than that, you just get a flat line. Hardly happens with modern amplifiers, so that's not really a big issue. And the other one is signal loss. Okay, so if there's breaks in your line, in your wires, or if the electrode gets disconnected from the scalp, you didn't put enough gel inside, and so on, you might get artifacts in your signal. These are easy to detect. The first two ones are harder to detect and are actually a challenge. Okay, so this is what EEG looks like when you run it. Okay, and you can already see that you have these big spikes, like this one and this one and this one, and these are blinks. These are cases when the subject blinked. Okay, so all of this is going to be really difficult to analyze because of these huge potentials relative to the small potentials that we want to measure. Okay? So what do we do about these about artifacts? We can either try to reduce them a priori, which is best. Okay? Try to make our signals as clean as possible. For instance, by instructing the subjects not to move the eyes, or by giving them blink breaks when they can sort of refresh their eyes and not blink at the time when we want them not to blink, or make them very relaxed so that they don't have too much tension in their muscles. Okay, so these are really important things when you run the experiment. As they say, garbage in, garbage out. Okay, so if you collect bad data, it's going to be difficult to recover it. So this is what I call reduce. Then, once you already recorded the data and you have artifacts, you want to try to either discard parts of the data which have big artifacts. So you just mark them and say, this is bad, I'm not going to use it. That's a shame. You lost a lot of time and money and the subject's time. So you try not to discard too much data, but in many cases there is no choice. And the last thing is to try to, in some way mathematically, remove or separate the real signal from the artifacts. Okay? And there are various ways to do it. I'll just give you a hint. Does everybody know what ICA is? Independent component analysis? Anybody doesn't know? Okay, so I'll give you I won't explain ICA, of course, but I will just show this slide for those who don't know or didn't think about it. Michal discussed ICA? Okay, so let me just say the idea is that we have sensors here in microphones, but we have EEG, okay? And there are many sources of activity. Here people speak. Every one of these microphones records all of these people together. And by using a mathematical trick called independent component analysis, we try to separate or regenerate the sources separately, each one separately. Okay, and there are ways to do it if you have enough sensors or microphones relative to the number of people that you record. So that's ICA. And now let's go to the artifacts. And I'm going to show you muscle artifacts. So this is what the head looks like, and if you see this picture, you will always remember why we have so much problem with muscle artifacts. The head is covered with muscles. The only place where we don't have muscles is here, at the very, very top. Okay. Just to illustrate how difficult this issue is, especially when you look at higher frequencies in your data. So there's a crazy group in Australia that injected to themselves, the researchers themselves injected to themselves curare, which is a drug that blocks your muscles. This is the thing that you get in surgery. So once you're anesthetized, they give you curare so that they can sort of open your abdomen, and so the muscles are relaxed. But then, of course, they have to ventilate because your muscles, your respiration muscles don't work as well. So these crazy people didn't anesthetize them, so they actually awake. They injected curare, except for the fact that they had this block here, so that the curare couldn't get to their fingers, so that they could press a button. Okay, and they were ventilated by a kind of ventilator. Anyhow, they got oxygen. They're alive still today. But what you see here is the spectrum. So this is the frequency, and this is the amplitude. And you see here, and the spike is nothing important. This is the line noise, okay, the 50 hertz from their electrical devices. But what you can see is that all these high frequencies over here, above 40, drop down immediately when you block the muscles, which means that most of the power that we have in EEG in these high frequencies comes from muscles, not from the brain. Okay? And you can see here, this is the normal rest EEG, the power of the gamma range, 30 to 100 hertz. You see that exactly where the muscles are. You see a lot of high frequency. And then when paralyzed, there is no power. Okay? So don't do it at home.
don't do it at all. And if you do it, then let me know, because I have some interesting experiments that I would like to run while you do it. Okay. Anyhow, so. Pardon? So, wait. Keep this question, okay? Wait. So it's a big problem, okay? So we do want to record high gamma activity. We do want to record activity in general, and the muscles are in our way. So we want to somehow try to remove as much as we can from this data. So I'm skipping a few things, but so we do this ICA trick, okay? We do the ICA trick. Each independent component is in EEG. Each independent component is characterized by a fixed sculpt distribution. Okay, it has one sculpt distribution which changes in amplitude over time. Okay, so each independent component has a topography, and it varies. The amplitude of this topography varies over time. Okay, you can do the ICA either on time or on space, and here this is what we call independent component analysis. The idea is, or ideally, we would like to think that each of these components represents a source, either on the brain or outside the brain, but a spatial source. And since it's a spatial source, it always has the same topography. But it can be either weakly activated or highly activated over time. Yeah.
I missed the components are the electrodes or the different.
No, a component is a topography. Okay, so across all electrodes, it's a topography which may vary in intensity over time. So think about it as a source in the brain, which can be active or not active, and this topography, because of its orientation, this source, because of its orientation and location in the brain, has some projection on the skull.
So it's a pattern over all of the electrodes?
Exactly, it's a pattern over all of the electrodes, which together become stronger or weaker over time. And so the components can either be really things in the brain, or they can be a muscle that is active or not active at some point. So what you see here are different components, and the way we show it is that you see on top the topography from the top, from the back, and from the front. Okay. Here, so this is the component distribution. This is the raw time course of the component over time. This is the power, the broadband power of this component over time. Okay. This is the spectrum of the component data without time resolution, just the spectrum of the component data. And over here, what you see is different kind of time locking. So in this case, this is this data, but time locked and averaged to the blinks. Okay. Here, it's time locked and averaged relative to saccades, to rapid eye movements. Here, it's time locked and averaged relative to the stimuli that we presented. Okay. And down below, it's the same thing, but in time frequency. Okay. Now, this, for instance, is a blink component. Okay, we know that this is a blink component. You can see, for example, that when we time lock it to the blink, you get a very nice, clean component, but less so when we lock it to other events. Okay, and you can also see the topography, which is just above and below the eye. Okay, so this is the blink component, and the idea is. Sorry, I'll stop this. Where were we? Okay, so this was clearly a blink component. This is a component This is a component which comes from the eye, so this is an ocular component, eye movement. Okay, so again, the topography is around the eye, and it's very sharp around the saccade. Okay, but more importantly, I want to show you.
What do you mean it's sharp around the saccade? With only one saccade?
No. There were many saccades, but we averaged over all the saccades. Okay, we time locked the component we broke into segments around the saccade and then averaged them. Okay, and then you see this sharp potential over here. The muscles. Okay, so if you look at the spectrum of the muscle activity, you see that it has this very long and broad tail, okay, of frequencies from 20 hertz and all the way up. Okay, this is very different from a neural component, which has this kind of what we call 1/f response. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time. So just to compare these two, if you just look at the component, it's pretty easy to say this is a muscle, this is not a muscle. Okay. And the importance of this is that it allows us to now take this component and remove it from the data. Okay, because we can since we decompose the data into several components, we can reconstruct the data by recombining the components, but we can recombine the components excluding one, which we think is a source of noise. Okay, and that's the way we use ICA to remove the blinks and sometimes ocular artifacts and sometimes clear muscle artifacts. So these are just examples of different muscles. You see, these are different muscles. You can see that all of them has this kind of a signature of high frequency. Yeah.
So usually you identify which components come from where just visually, or
we do all of these. So we look at it to try to. It's really a kind of an art to define sources of noise with ICA. But to make it less of an art, we use both the distribution, and you see the distribution is very clear. It's very specific, which is not very much like a neural component, which always will be broader. Okay, so it has a specific distribution, and it has this type of broad, so we know that this is a muscle. Okay, yeah.
Doesn't that mean that you're assuming that muscles are independent of each other? Clearly not the case.
They're independent of each other to a certain extent. Okay, and if they're not, then it doesn't really matter as long as we remove the whole thing. So if we remove two muscles and they're not completely independent, that's fine too.
All the muscles are dependent.
Not necessarily. Why?
Like not.
Why, yes. Well, I mean, I can move this finger and this finger will not move.
Yes, but those spatial expressions change many muscles together.
Sometimes. So then we will try to remove all of these muscle artifacts, and even if we didn't decompose them completely, it will still remove the noise. Now, what you're saying is actually correct and even more serious than the way you presented it, because the real problem and the real risk, and the reason we use it very, very carefully, these things, okay? And actually in my lab we usually use ICA mainly to remove blinks, which are so clear and so independent that we feel safe to remove them. But the real risk is that not that there is no independence between the muscles, but that these components include some neural activity. So they're not, that the muscle activity and the neural activity were not decomposed well. Okay? But really, it's a matter of how many sensors you have and how distinct this was. So it's not clear that each of these components is a clean muscle artifact. So we have to do it very carefully. But this is the method, the main method that is used. So I'm going to skip again some examples. Okay, so that was the ICA. But I'll give you and come now to our Viv's question. Okay, so it sounds like they're making like shakes, fruit shakes, no? but they're actually vacuuming the floor. Maybe it's the time that makes me think of food. Okay, so this is a nice story which is also strongly connected to LSEC. So I'll tell you the story because it gives you the flavor of the problem of artifacts and what they can do. So many years ago, Gray and Singer recorded from the cat's visual cortex, and they recorded from neurons which from adjacent neurons, and they mapped their receptive fields. Okay, so here you see the receptive field of one neuron, and here the receptive field of the other neuron. And what you see below is the cross-correlogram of the two neurons. So how correlated is their activity in time? And what they did was to pass a bar of light across the receptive field. And when they did that, when it is a long bar of light which crossed both receptive fields, they got a very nice pattern of correlation between these two neurons at around a rate of 40 hertz. Okay, so this is around a 40 hertz oscillation, and the correlation of this oscillation between these two neurons. And it was even more intriguing that when they broke the line, and they were two independent lines, and they moved them across these two receptive fields, they also got this nice cross correlation. But when they took these two lines and moved them one in one direction and the other in the opposite direction, so that it doesn't look like it's one line crossing the two receptive fields, this correlation broke down. Okay? So it looked like, okay, so this is the way it was. This is either this way or that way. Okay, so it looks like when you have something which is bound, like two objects which are bound, they are bound by the fact that these two neurons synchronize their activity at a rate of about 40 hertz. And there have been several other studies that showed kind of the same thing. If you look, I didn't bring the slide, but if you look at every one of these neurons separately, you see that they do have this oscillation of their LFP around 40 hertz. And this shows you that not only do they have this oscillation, but they synchronize their oscillations. So it's a really nice way of binding across different locations in space, right? The neurons sync together, and therefore they know that they belong to the same object. Binding being one of the most important questions of cognitive science. So that made a lot of impact in the field, and still does. But then, like 10 years later, this group of researchers in France said, well, let's see if we can find evidence of this kind of binding using EEG. Okay, and they presented this study that I already showed you, where they had these Kanitsa triangles or rotated Pac-Man, and lo and behold, when they did that, and they did the time frequency analysis that we discussed already, they found that indeed, this around 40 hertz, you get an increase in the power of gamma, around 300 milliseconds after the stimulus is presented, when you actually have this binding, when you have a coherent triangle formed between the Kanitsa, between the Pac-Man, but not when you don't have this Kanitsa triangle formed. Okay, so this looks like a really nice analog recorded from the scalp to the finding of Gray and Singer in the cat and in the monkey. And several other groups went after this gamma activity, and for instance showed that the gamma activity is stronger. You see here just the power of gamma over time. So you see it gets stronger when you see a coherent object, but not when you take the very same object and just distort it using Photoshop. So it's the same colors, the same contrast, and so on. The only thing is that in one there is a coherent object, and in the other there is no coherent object. Okay. Now, one thing I have to mention that I kind of skipped in the other presentation for the sake of time, but it will become material, is that the way these time frequency plots are formed is by calculating the time frequency spectrogram of each trial, and then averaging all these spectrograms. Okay, so the phase information is lost. Okay, so we see just the power over time, over frequencies,
averaged across trials. And that will become important. That's called, the name is induced activity rather than evoked activity. Yeah.
Did someone try, check what's going on in the brain? Like, as you showed.
That's what we're trying to do.
No, I didn't translate it well. To check what the signal means in terms of the mechanism. Something similar to here, but more detailed.
So in animals, definitely. So there are groups which are investigating this kind of oscillations. Pascal Singer and then Pascal Fries, who was his student and now runs an institute in Frankfurt. They definitely, this is one of the most important things that they do. They try to figure out what are the mechanisms that create these oscillations and how these synchronizations are formed and in which frequencies.
What?
What do they find?
Yeah.
Not now. Okay, so we're talking about methods. Yeah.
I don't really understand the difference between induced and evoked.
I tried to. Let's get into it. I'll say it in one sentence, and if it's not clear, I'll explain it later if you want. But you can either first average all the trials, and then do this time frequency analysis. That's called evoked. Okay. Or you can first do the time frequency analysis on every trial and then average over those. So that's the difference between evoked and induced. When you do the evoked type of activity, if the oscillations are not in phase with each other from trial to trial, they will. Okay. I'll show this slide. Where is it? It's not here. It's in the other presentation. Okay, so imagine these situations. So pay attention, because I skipped it not because it's not important, but I just had to decide what. So since we're doing it, let's concentrate for a second. So imagine you have this kind. These are different trials. First trial, second trial, third trial, fourth, and so on. Okay, you could have at some points in these trials there is an increase in the power of this oscillation, whatever its frequency is. Okay. Now, in one situation, forget about the analysis. In one situation in the brain, it could be that the phase of this oscillation is always the same. So, say here we presented the stimulus, and exactly at this point the oscillation starts, and it starts always at the same phase. So, from trial to trial, you see exactly the same oscillation with the same phase. Okay. Another situation could be that sometime after the stimulus, there is an increase in the power of the same type of oscillation, but from trial to trial, the phase is not consistent. Okay, sometimes it starts at this phase, and sometimes at this phase, and sometimes at this phase. So either it's jittering in time or jittering in phase. It's the same thing basically, but over the trials, the phases do not synchronize. They're not coherent. Now, what will happen if I just simply average those trials? Okay, if I do this. If I average, the evoked activity is going to stay high, right? Because the phases are synchronized. But if I average across what I call induced activity, the phase jittered activity, then even though every single trial had increased power, the average will show low power, right? Because the phases cancel each other from trial to trial. Okay, so to get around this, to be able to recover this and not this, the way to do it is to take these single trials, not average them like here, okay, but first calculate the time frequency time frequency spectrogram from each trial, okay, and then average those to get one average time frequency map, okay. And the reason this works is because pictorially, the way I just described it, and more mathematically, the reason is that when I show you this, there is no phase anymore. You know, the decomposition separates the phase from the power. I don't look at the phase anymore. I just look at the power, and therefore I can get this type of map. Okay, so that's called induced response, and the other one is called evoked response. And you can think about it either as an analytic process, where you measure the induced response or the evoked response, but also as two types of activities in the brain, which can be ones with high inter-trial coherence or low inter-trial coherence. Okay.
Can this introduce like artifacts? I mean, if there are oscillations that are not from the same thing, they will still be here.
They will.
You'll see them as locked to each other.
I'm not sure what do you mean by locked to each other.
If there's something else that may cause the same kind of oscillation, but it's not what we want, and it's in a different time from the other oscillations, you will still see it as part of the signal.
So it depends on what is your temporal resolution, right? So if the activity is, the jitter is so big, okay, that you might say, I'm not sure I'm measuring the same thing. You know, why would you call something that happens at 200 milliseconds and at 400 milliseconds in different trials? Why would you call it the same thing and try to measure it together? So that's a question that you have to ask yourself when you do the analysis. You know, what is your temporal resolution? What is your reasonable temporal resolution? Which would
take a window and
yeah. So you have to figure out what type of jitter you're allowing, okay, in this analysis. Okay, so that was just to explain the method. And now the story continues, that once we did the same kind of experiments in my lab, and we even showed that not only is that it's coherent object versus incoherent object, but also when you present it, for instance, a cat with the bark or a cat with a meow, you get different responses. But then clever people in ELSIC commented that this kind of response looks to them more like a spike than an oscillation. Okay, and so we went on to figure out what exactly could be happening, and we found that when we look at the eye movement, we look at saccades after the stimulus, we see that after the presentation of the stimulus at time 0, there is a reduction in the probability of saccades, and then an increase in the probability of saccades later. Okay. This is saccades, quick moving, very small saccades, miniature saccades, and so this is. And then when we looked at the peaks at spikes in the EEG, we saw that they have the same kind of pattern. Okay, and if we just look at the histogram of the saccades here, and we just shift it to this histogram of the peaks, it's exactly the same. And if you take another subject, you see the same thing, and another subject which doesn't have so much increase in saccades after this break, they also don't have an increase in the spikes in the EEG. So all this together led to the conclusion that these spikes, which create this high frequency activity, are actually saccades. Okay, they are not neural activity. Why? Because this is the EEG. This is the eye position. So the eyes are here, and then they move to this point, and then they move to this point. Okay, and every time the eye moves, we see a spike in the EEG. Okay, and when we translate this to the frequency domain, it creates this large blob of broadband activity. This is because of the nature of the frequency transformation. That's the way it is. Sharp spikes create broadband power. Okay, so
after having discovered that, why do we see this kind of a gamma activity together with coherent object, with Kanitsa triangles and so on? The reason is, one, is that many people have shown before that when you try to fixate on something, your eyes occasionally make these microsaccades, but once an event happens, you stop making these microsaccades and then you increase your microsaccades. We showed that every microsaccade creates a spike in the EEG. Each spike creates this blob of activity in the power time frequency domain, and if you average over these, you get exactly the response that we saw before. Okay, so in fact, what looked like a neural response that had to do with coherent object is actually more eye movements for coherent objects. Okay, so it turned out that some objects elicit more of these saccades than others. So this is an example for a systematic artifact. Okay, something which has to do with your manipulation and is why it was missed for so long by others and by us. Okay. If you have to, only if you have to. Okay, so then otherwise ask me later because I'm actually going to miss the main part of my talk today. Okay, so what I want to finish with is to say a few words about what exactly do we want to measure from the ERP, which is not trivial. And there are two cases I want to make. One is when you know what you're looking for, so you have an a priori hypothesis, and the other one is when you don't have an a priori hypothesis, you just want to see what happens. I mean, I did this manipulation. What's going to happen to the ERPs? Okay? So these are generally the two types of analysis that you want to do. And the first case is when you know what you want to do, and then you have some kind of an ROI, region of interest. And the region of interest in our case would be defined in time. So when along time is the region of interest? Where on the scalp is my region of interest? And also, what is its morphology? What does the waveform look like? Or in other words, what is the frequency spectrum of this event that I'm looking for? So I need to define my a priori hypothesis relative to some known phenomena which is well characterized. Okay. So I just showed you like half an hour ago several of these kind of ROIs. I may want to measure the P3 or the mismatch negativity or the N170, and I know where it's supposed to be and when in time it's supposed to be and what it should be looking like, and then I want to measure it and see how my manipulation actually affected this component. Okay. Now I get these ERPs, okay, and I know that I wanted to measure this. Suppose let's say it's the mismatch negativity. Okay, I know that it's this negativity between 100 and 300 milliseconds that I want to measure. But what do I measure exactly? So I may want to measure the amplitude of this response. Okay. But then the question is, amplitude relative to what? Okay. So usually we do it relative to some resting baseline or some passive baseline before the stimulus happens. But it's not always the good choice. And I'm saying it so that you think what is the baseline against which you want to measure your amplitude. The other thing is, I remember that we have reference electrodes, okay? And we have a reference electrode, and it makes a difference what was my reference when I recorded the data, because that will determine the amplitude that I measure at any given electrode. So these two have to be taken in consideration. Okay. Then the question is, what amplitude of what? I mean, am I going to measure the peak of this and the peak of this? Am I going to average some window of time around some peak or around some a priori determined time? All of these are options that people use. Okay, but they have to be determined and better determined a priori. Okay. Then the other thing that I may want to measure is the latency of the component. So in some cases, my manipulation is not going to change so much the amplitude of the response, but whether it comes late or early. Okay. So I want to measure the latency, and then again, I have many things that I could want to measure. I may want to measure the latency of the peak.
okay, or I may want to measure when this thing started, or when it ended, or what is its duration. All of these are legitimate dependent variables which depend on your question, but they should be, you should know what they are in advance, okay? And then once we do that, we want to do some statistics. So this is like an example of a straightforward approach used in many ERP studies, and then you can make variations in the line that I just described to each component. So you determine the window a priori or based on your grand average. Okay, you average all the subjects, you see what the latency, general latency that you're interested in is, and then you define this as your window. It has problems, but I won't mention them right now. Okay, then you measure the amplitude for each subject in this window in different conditions, and then you run your statistics, which would usually be a within subject analysis, a t-test or an analysis of variance if you have more than two conditions. Okay, so look at this, for example. This is a real experiment. This is the average of all the subjects in one condition, and this is the average of all the subjects in another condition. And now I want to make an argument that this is bigger than this. Okay? The way I do it is that I look at my individual subjects, which, as you see, are quite variable, even though they give me this nice average. But they're variable. Okay? So I need to look at each individual subject, and in a given window that I determined in some way, I'm going to measure the amplitude for each of the subjects, put it in a table, and do my statistics. Okay, so that's like a cookbook for the simplest ERP experiment. But I would say 80% of ERP experiments go along more or less this idea. But the question again is, how did you determine the window? Yes, and how did what kind of component did you choose to measure, and so on. So there were a lot of blanks in this straightforward analysis as well. So I put this here to warn you that the way I determine this window or this region of interest has to be, as best I can, unbiased. So I want to define my region of interest without knowing too much about my results. I don't want to choose a window in which I already see that there is some effect, right? Because that will bias my analysis. So the way to do it is, ideally, even before I started the experiment, I know exactly what the window is, what electrodes I'm going to measure, and so on, because I read the literature. There are so many experiments that have been done before, or I did a previous experiment, and I'm just using these blind. I don't know what will happen in my experiment, but I'm using this. This is completely unbiased. The other workarounds that people use, which have some risk of being biased, but they're better than others, is, for instance, to try to first look at all the conditions together without separating them, so I don't know which is bigger than which. Okay, and making some wise selection about the ROI without knowing anything about the results. So if you want to know why this can go wrong, Tal will be happy to explain this to you. Okay, but in general, in many cases, this is kind of good enough if you don't have an option to do it in a really separate data set. Yeah.
Then you do this, and then with a few subjects, and then after now you know a priori what you want.
That would be great. That would be great if you could do like a first pilot study. Okay. Define your ROI, and then do another set of subjects, or you can take, if you have enough time with each subject, take one block from each subject, do your analysis, and then do your analysis on the other part of the data, but not use the same data for both. Okay, some cases it can work, and that's of course the best thing you can do. Okay, these are the best thing that you can do. We don't have much time, so I'm just going to pick. It was very interesting. Okay, I think I'll just stop, and we'll find a time to go on, and some of it will be in the lab. Okay. Thank you.